All right. So Lucas and I are going to talk about our squash variety trials in 2020 with the Dry Farming Collaborative. So our objectives in 2020 were to evaluate 3 commonly grown delicata squash varieties under dry farmed conditions on multiple sites. In the past, we had grown Zeppelin delicata, which is pictured here on the bottom left of the pictures, but we hadn't really trialed any other varieties of delicata. And for Maxima Squash, we wanted to evaluate 3 varieties that had performed well in previous trials with the Dry Farming Collaborative, as well as with Alex Stone and Jenny Wetzel. But wanted to trial those on multiple sites with the Dry Farming Collaborative. And an additional third objective was to pilot SeedLinked app as a platform for data collection. So our protocol for trial participants in brief was to transplant or direct seed when the soil was 60 degrees Fahrenheit or more, which tends to be May. We recommended participants use row cover for about 1 month after the plants emerge or they're transplanted in the field because of cucumber beetles. And additionally, not to irrigate, because we are assessing how these varieties do dry farmed on different sites, and recommended diligent weed management. On the bottom left here, you can see like plot schematic. So 20 foot by 5 foot is 100 square feet, which might be, different dimensions on different sites based on equipment and what that plot, what's there. So 3 plants per 100 square feet was what we recommended. For the delicata squash varieties, we included Honeyboat, Candy Stick Dessert, and Zeppelin delicata. From those seed sources listed on the right, both Candy Stick and Zeppelin are Open Seed Source Initiative pledged varieties, meaning that if you save seed, you cannot have intellectual property rights on any plant breeding work you do with those varieties. And the varieties are pictured across the bottom there in order, with Honeyboat on the left, Candy Stick, Dessert in the middle, and Zeppelin on the right. So they have a little bit different phenotypes. And this is what the back end of the SeedLink platform looks like. This is what the dashboard looks like. You can see our map of trial participants there. We had 25 people sign up. You can see here on the bottom left corner, these are the different characteristics. The characteristics that we were collecting feedback on are also listed here along the side. So we asked for dates, both planting, transplanting, first harvest, last harvest, germination, all the way through to storage. And you can see here in the bottom left corner for the delicata trial, we are still collecting storage data. We're going to collect that data until April. So this is looking at the analytics in SeedLinked. So when we select all those different characteristics, compile all the feedback we've gotten from participants thus far, there's really not a huge difference between Zeppelin, Honeyboat, and Candy Stick. You can see it looks like when we asked the question, would you dry farm or would you grow this variety again? It looks like a little bit more, there's a little bit more of a preference for Zeppelin than the other 2, but not a huge difference. So to look, when I looked through at each individual characteristic, we can start to see a little bit of difference, but not much. For flavor, for example, we've had 7 reviews so far on flavor, and Honeyboat and Zeppelin are pretty similar, just slightly lower on Candy Stick. And the recommendation that I made and that I did myself for our, evaluating flavor of these varieties was just to cut them in half, scoop the seeds out, sea salt, olive oil, and roast them, and then just taste them as is without any additional seasoning or flavors. So that's flavor. Yield, it looks like Zeppelin was rated a little higher in yield, and you can see on the right-hand side, I've got a picture of, this is a tote from 1 plot of Zeppelin delicata. Zeppelin delicata typically has, like I said before, we're recommending 3 plants per plot. So on the, looking at the quantitative data that we collected at the OSU sites, we kind of see that same trend. So Zeppelin delicata, so we're looking at light blue as the marketable yield, which across varieties, there's a little overlap in these bars. So Candy Stick, Honey Boat, and Zeppelin all had pretty similar marketable yields, but total yield was quite a bit higher. And that shows in this in this picture here. But an important note to bring your attention to on the bottom is that on the OSU plots, I forgot to thin. So there was 2 plants in each spot. So that was actually six plants per plot. But it still averaged out to be 6 to 8 pounds of squash per plant on average. Whether it was 3 plants, well, you'll see in a second. So looking at the storage trial, marketable yield remaining in January, we had 1 case of each variety that we put into storage, and we evaluated monthly, but just reporting January's data here because we haven't collected February's yet. So it was the percent marketable was calculated based on total number of squash we started with. And I will note that in all transparency, the storage conditions and the facility are not ideal. There's not insulation, tends to get kind of humid. We had access to wax produce boxes, which is problematic in a humid, uninsulated space. So maybe a model for exactly how not to store squash. So I think that the seedling trial results that come in that are due in April, it'll be interesting to see how our participants rate the squash. So if you're a trial participant, we'll be looking for your storage data to look at, since ours, I think, I'd take it with a grain of salt. And I will hand it off to Lucas to talk about the Maxima Squash trial.
Thanks, Amy. So I was the coordinator of the Maxima Squash trial last year, and we evaluated the varieties Silver Bell from Restoration Seeds, Stella Blue seed from Seed Revolution Now, and then Tetsukabuto from Johnny's Seeds. And you'll note that it's not completely a Maxima. It's actually just half of a Cucurbita Maxima. It's a hybrid with a Machada as well. So it's an interesting variety, and it's been an interesting experience comparing that to the Maxima varieties. And the seedling trials for the Maxima Squash, there were 10 participants, and here's a map of their distribution. Yeah, we had a little bit less participation, as you'll see, but so the Maxima Squash trial, in addition to the seedling participants, we had 2 main research sites. One at the OSU Vegetable Research Farm, and you'll see the white arrows in the top right pointing to the Maxima Squash sections. And then we had another one at Soul Cycle Farm. And in both of these farms, we did an irrigated comparison as well. So we'll be looking at that in the data. And they're direct seeded and transplanted June 1st. And the irrigated treatment received about 1.5 inches of irrigation per week of June through the middle of August. These are just some pictures of the varieties, how they look in the field dry farmed. You'll see the haze. This was during the big smoke out in 2020, the wildfires. You can see that particularly the Silver Bell variety on the right, that's drying down faster than the others, so it seemed to be a little earlier. Tetsukabuto was the most vigorous and seemed to still want to grow into October. And these are just a couple irrigated examples. So with the Maxima yields results, first of all, looking at seed length, we had only 2 participants so far to report the yield. So we could take it with a grain of salt that, if there were more participants, then we might find different trends. And however, our quantitative results across 2 field sites show that with the dry farmed yield in red, that Tetsukabuto was the higher yielder, and irrigated Stella Blue and Tetsukabuto were comparable. Silver Bell at slightly lower yields, and I also called it the dots, the size of the dots based on fruit size. You'll see that Tetsukabuto fruit size is closer to 3 or 4 pounds, and Stella Blue and Silver Bell were more like 5 or 6 pounds each. So with dry farming and irrigated comparisons in the same fields, we have the opportunity to figure out yields comparisons. And so these percentages are dry farm yield as a percent of the irrigated yield. And that's both in terms of, in the middle column, yield per plant, and then fruit size on the right side. So you'll see that on average, dry farm plants produced 64% of irrigated plants in terms of yields. The fruit size was not too much smaller, but 91% of irrigated. And then we had a couple of reviews of the flavor ratings, and this is early on in the seedling trial, so there could be more reviews, and the squash is still maturing, and so the flavors can change. But we have Silver Bell and Sterile Blue as preferred over Tetsukabuto. And then as of January 15th, last month, we have our storage trial results showing that Tetsukabuto dry farmed is, we haven't lost any squash due to mold. It's comparable to the irrigated. But when you look at Silver Bell and Sterile Blue, you see that there's a much higher reduction in marketable squash that are irrigated. So this is not new to us. We've seen in the past that dry farming can increase storability of your produce. And when we take these proportions marketable in January and modify our yield in October to say, what's our squash yield in January? By the way, this is a storage squash, so ideally the squash should provide longer than just harvest season. And what we see is that the dry farm yield is more comparable to irrigated yields. And in the case of Silver Bell, dry farm yield in January is higher than irrigated yields.
So looking at our key takeaways, and then we can go to questions. So for the delicata overall, the 3 varieties that we grew, Honeyboat, Candy Stick, and Zeppelin, there was really no huge difference in the marketable yield between the varieties. There was a difference in the total yield. Zeppelin was a little higher, but the marketable yield was very similar. And after looking at the data across sites, seems like 6 to 8 pounds per plant on average was expected. All 3 of those varieties kind of on average were 6 to 8 pounds per plant. And then something that I find really exciting is that the qualitative seed link reviews that our participants provided really aligned well with the quantitative data that we collected at a couple of sites that OSU managed. And this is pretty amazing because it's a lot more expensive to do variety trials and count and weigh everything. And the developers of the SeedLinked app have seen this as well, in that the qualitative data provided in SeedLinked, when you have a large number of participants, really correlates well with the quantitative yield. So I think that there's a lot of potential here for us moving forward and engaging more people in our variety trials.
Yeah, and continuing with the takeaways for the Maxima trial and continuing with SeedLinked, yes, we had fewer reviews at SeedLinked, but it was still a really good platform to engage with producers. It simplified how we can collect data, and it's just something that we can build on into the future. The main takeaways from the Maxima trial was that Tetsukabuto proved to be vigorous and long storing, and did exceptionally well in dry farm conditions, although it's slightly different than your classical Maxima squash. The dry farmed squash produced 10 to 20 pounds per plant, and the dry farm yield reduction that we see due to dry farming can be redeemed later on in the storage season, because dry farm produce can store better. So that's one reason why to not get too discouraged by yield reduction in dry farming.
And with that, we can move to questions. Thanks, Lucas. Looks like we have a few questions coming in. already. And I think Alex has some great comments. So Alex and Ginny Wetzel did a couple years of squash work, and Alex mentions here that Tetsukabudo was at peak culinary quality January through March, but not before. So maybe some of the reviews that came in before that, you know, they just weren't quite ripe yet. And Alex mentions that they store into May and beyond. So that's kind of wild. That's a long storing of squash. Okay, I'll just start fielding questions, Matt, and and Lucas, maybe when they're directed to you, unmute and feel free to jump in and help here.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Okay, Bonnie's asking, how did your not thinning delicata plot compare in yield in the other fields planted at three plants per 100 square foot? So in the handout that Matt just provided, there was a trial host, actually Full Cellar Farm, Emily Cooper, maybe here. If she is, she had quantitative yield data per plot and fruit count. So I looked at her data was very comparable to the 6 plants per plot. We both grew the same variety. She grew 3 replicates of each, as did I, but at 2 different sites, 3 reps of each at 2 different sites. And in both cases, it was 6 to 8 pounds per plant. So I'm not sure what to make of that. I don't know if we will get the same results if we did it again, but this, at least in 2020, it would have been interesting if I did a density trial, which Alex Stone and Jenny Wetzel did a few years ago in a larger squash project. But yeah, 6 to 8 pounds per plant. It seemed like that's what Emily got on her 3 plants per plot. And that's also what I got with 6 plants per plot.
Yeah, and I wanted to comment a little more on the culinary quality question with the Maximas. And yeah, in particular, since that talk, I have been trying Tetsukabudo more, and it definitely has a very comparable quality of flavor with Stella Blue and Silver Bell. The texture is a little more stringy, almost like a spaghetti squash.
Yeah, I've been enjoying that one as well. It's like really vibrant orange right now, the one I cut open last week, and just really rich, yummy squash flavor. Chris up in Washington is commenting here that his non-irrigated Stella Blue actually performed better than his irrigated. So Lucas, you've done some irrigated dry farm comparisons. Have you noticed a difference in Stella Blue's performance irrigated and dry farm between those years?
We've tested it a couple years, and we found that in terms of yields, the dry farm squash was a little lower, although in prior years it was like up to 80-85% of the irrigated yields, so it did really well. Yeah, in terms of storability, I think Stella Blue dry farmed does perform better. And I haven't done much taste testing for comparison, but that would be some fun future work.
We have a few more minutes. Carol and Bill Sudkiss, if you're on here, would you mind? I wanted to see if you wouldn't mind unmuting, and if there's not any more questions coming in. I thought they did a really, they participated in the squash trial and also did kind of an outreach thing with the local co-op in Salem. So if you're with us and willing to share, please feel free to share for a couple minutes about that experience.
We're here.
Oh, great. Thank you.
We sort of wonder about the volume you guys are producing. We did the delicata, and our average poundage per plant was 83 pounds. We had 600 squash off of 9 plants. And so that's a lot more than what your trials are. We're not quite sure why we got that. What we did was the area was put to clover over the winter. We weed whacked the clover in the spring, covered it with about 4 inches of sawdust horse manure, and then planted it in there. We had almost no weeds and great production. So we're not quite sure why it's so different than than what you're getting. But we advocate for home gardening to do a mulch. I think it really makes a difference. We ended up with the 600 plants, squash, so a little bit more than what we could eat. And so we took 200 of them to Life Source, the natural food store in Salem. And the idea was that we gave the 2 Life Source, we didn't charge them anything for it, and that they were to give them out to their customers and ask for feedback on the taste. And it sort of worked out. What they ended up doing, we worked with the people in produce. We should have worked with the people in marketing. And they marketed most of them just as local growing. And they didn't talk about the fact that they were dry farmed or dry gardened. But they did at the end have some. And we don't know how many, maybe 25 or 50 left at the end that they gave away for free and asked people to give them feedback on their website as to the quality. And there were only 9 respondents to that. 8 of them found that the responses were more along the lines of, are these squash good enough to continue growing? And it wasn't so much that they were saying, are they better or not? Or just, so most people responded along the lines that, oh yeah, these are fine, these are great. One person thought they weren't as sweet as her regular squash. But I think what was significant was that Life Source then did an article on their website about the dry farming, dry gardening, which is really excellent. And I think it was new to a lot of the people at Life Source that there could be a difference in the produce here. So that was one of our reasons for going to Life Source, was to try to expand the sellers who might be interested in buying dry farm produce. So I think they would be very interested. If anybody were interested in growing something for them, they'd be a possibility.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's a good kind of place to plug. In the focus groups this afternoon, there is a session on kind of focus group on marketing. And so it's great to, I'm starting to see more dry farm produce at the market, and we're gonna have a discussion about how to kind of launch a dry farmed logo and in one of the focus group sessions this afternoon. And just one more note in the chat box, Alex shared a video in there of Chef Lisa Hornes, a pastry chef from Portland, on cooking with Tetsukubudo. So there you have it.